Here's all the components involved when you install Train America's Engineer on Board system. Now, we're using a locomotive that's one of MTH's very early Rail King models. It's an MT1105, Norfolk and Western J. Here's the motherboard, and there's the second board. That's the sensor board that goes on the flywheel on the engine. There's a number of Molex connections for paired wires, a Molex connection for a quad, a couple of slide switches, the antenna strip. Here are the sensor strips that go around the flywheel on the motor. And then there are various other connectors, a speaker, the 8-pin harness that goes between the engine and the tender. This is a very complete kit that'll let you convert almost any engine with a flywheel to command control and rail sounds. The instructions say to do the work in the tender first, so we've set the engine aside so we can strip out the old components in the tender. Now in this old tender we've got a very simple old sound system, a speaker, and a switch. So let's get those pieces out and we'll get down to the bare sheet metal because we've got some hole drilling to do to mount the new motherboard. So just remove everything from the frame so that we can get the frame clean and ready to punch and drill. Here's the board. And on this locomotive and tender, this is going to be a very tight fit because all of this has to go into this tender and it's going to have to go all the way up in the front. So that means it'll just fit, just barely fit up there like that. If you have real tight clearances like I do with this tender, you have to scribe these lines really precisely. So position the Engineer on Board up into the body, put the tender frame where it's going to be like I have it here, and just put the head of a carpenter square in there, line it up directly with the hole, the mounting hole, and we'll just scribe a line right on the tender base. There we go. We know it's going to go there. And then we'll come up here on the front hole, and we'll scribe another line here. There. Now we know for sure exactly where these screws are going to fit on the frame. Now we're going to purposely offset this a little bit to that side to make a little more room over here on this side for the switches. We've got a slide switch that goes here, and we have a second switch that we have to drill a hole for, and we're going to use that little sub-mini toggle switch for the second switch and put it right in front, right there. When you mount the switch, pay particular attention to the top clearances, like that, as well as to the bottom clearances, because if you have a real short tender like we have, all the clearances could be a problem. This will work in the run position. We've drilled the two mounting holes here and deburred them, and we've also drilled a mounting hole for the little sub-mini toggle switch that we're going to add right beside this slide switch. Okay, we've got all the holes drilled, so now I need to begin to rebuild the tender frame from the bottom up. So we'll start with the wheels, and we'll just go up from there and finish our installation. You got to put the trucks on first, otherwise you won't be able to get at the screws to put the trucks on with the heat sink in place. There. We've got all of our connections on. We've got the speaker in. We've got the slide switch that we're going to use for the cruise control on and off. We've got our new sub-mini toggle switch that we're going to use for the run program switch. We've got the motherboard all mounted. So now we're ready to start putting on the tether, and then we'll fit it all up. We have to get the antenna on the outside of the casting on the tender. There's a couple of ways to do that. You could either mount the antenna underneath the tender, but in our case the tender is too short to do this. So we have to mount this onto the body of the tender to make the whole body the antenna. The instructions say to cut the foil off and just attach the wire to a screw somewhere inside the tender shell. But hey, we don't have a screw inside this tender shell, so we're going to have to make one little change. we're going to have to make this whole tender shell the antenna by scraping the paint off of the wall and applying that foil strip directly to the metal of the tender body. Now it's important to understand that has to be an electrical connection. So we'll do that and then we'll check it with a volt-ohm-meter to make sure we have an electrical connection. First thing we did is scrape some paint off the inside here and attach the antenna. I added a couple of drops of super glue or CA up here on the wire just to act as a strain relief so that we don't pull the antenna loose. And since this board has lots of electrical contacts all over the top of it, it's always a good idea to take black electrical tape and cover everything up here, especially since that antenna is exposed. Well, here's what the tender looks like when we're all done. We've added the 8-wire harness, and going systematically through the instructions that were provided by Train America, carefully following them step by step, we've attached every single item that we need to attach and plugged it into the Molex connector on the boards. So the tender is complete now. We'll set that aside, and all it needs when we're finished is just to plug in the antenna lead and to put the top on. But let's go take a look at the engine before we put the tender together. Here in the engine, we're going to install the heart of the whole system. The engineer on board system relies on measuring the speed of the motor so it can determine the chuff rate and everything else. This is the infrared sensor board that we need to mount up on top of the motor like this, and it's going to look down on a spinning tape that'll be mounted on this flywheel. We have a little problem though. This flywheel is pretty small in diameter, and the instructions say that it wants to see only 30 thousandths of an inch between here and here, so we've got a little work to do. This is the self-adhesive timing tape. There are several different engines that these tapes are for. Here's the MTH tape right here. So we'll cut this out, and that's what we carefully wrap around the flywheel, matching up the bars on the seam. The surface of the flywheel needs to be extremely clean and free of any smoke fluid or grease. So in the instructions it says use Goo Gone, which is an excellent solvent, to clean the surface of the flywheel before you apply the tape. Well, we've wrapped around the flywheel and we're back to where we started, but we want to be very careful not to let the adhesive on the back side of this piece touch the black bars that we've already applied. So work it around like this and see where the joint's going to be. Make a mark. Okay. Now I know where to cut on the paper. I'll cut it off right there and make a nice clean joint. There we are. And we'll just roll this around. And seal it up. This is the infrared speed sensing board. There's the little infrared sensor right there. And the instructions say that this needs to be within 30 thousandths of the surface of this wheel. And because we have such a small flywheel, we have a much bigger gap than that. So we're going to have to probably raise this up in the back so it comes down the front until we get that 30 thousandths. With this small flywheel, we've got kind of a unique problem here. Most flywheels on most motors that you're going to do this on, the flywheel is bigger than the motor. In that case, you have to space this sensor board up and away from the motor. But in our case, we have to raise the back end of this motor and tie it down tight here so that we can get this spacer that they provide in the kit to fit perfectly in between the infrared and the board. So we'll put the spacer in here, and then we'll pull this down till we get just enough. There we go. Now let's check that and make sure. That's it. That's what we need. If you're uncomfortable angling that sensor board down to the flywheel, if you have a small flywheel like this, you might want to try it this way. This is what Train America calls the bridge method. And what we've done is created a bridge out of a piece of plastic, turned the sensor board around and mounted it down like this under that bridge so that we can get that 30 thousandths clearance right there in between the sensor board and the reader tape. This is the old plug for the old tether, and we're not going to need that anymore, so I'm just going to cut the wires and we'll remove that and take it off because we're going to need that space for the new tether to go back out of the engine. So So let's get rid of this board. We've got her all unhooked now. We're ready to install our engine harness. And all we have to do is take all the leads from the engine socket, follow this wiring diagram that they provide in the EOB instruction sheet, and we'll attach the engine harness. We'll get all the wires tied down with a few zip ties to make sure that we don't get anything in the moving parts. Well, all right, looks like we're ready to put it on the track and try it out before we put the tender shell and the engine shell back on the chassis. For this test, we're going to use a temporary antenna. Since we've already mounted our permanent antenna into our tender shell, just go back into the kit and there's lots of extra wires with Molex connectors on them. We're going to take one of these and just use it as a temporary. We'll put it in place here right on the board. All right, we've got our temporary antenna mounted in there. And it's just a plain old wire sticking up like that. And he'll pick up the frequency radiating up from the track. So let's get him up here on the test track. We'll connect the harness to the engine. There's the antenna sticking out. There we go. We're ready for a test run. Now, I know you're going to be very anxious to do the same thing you do with any command locomotive, put it on the track and punch in engine 1 and go, but you're not ready for that yet. You can see here the instructions. We're ready right here on this section 3, and it has an initial testing phase. As you can see, there's a number of things that you need to go through and do to program the engine. And rather than for me to do that here step by step, it's a lot easier for you to follow the directions and do that than for me to show it to you on the video. So we've gone through and programmed all these separate steps in, and now we're ready to run the locomotive. Okay, I've got the track power up to 15 volts, and we've done all of our programming. So let's go for the engine 1 and boost. All right, we got sound. Now we got it set up on 4 chuffs per rev. There we go. Let's see, reverse. Okay, we're working. Time to put the shell on and try it out again, because it's very important to make sure that we've got all the insulated tape all the way around on the frame to make sure that the shell doesn't touch the tender anywhere. Let's get our shell positioned. We'll do the engine first. Now on this engine, it's got a hole back here in the back, and fortunately the hole's just the right size that we can tuck the harness plug right through that hole. So you want to be sure and do that before you put the shell in. There we go. Check as you're putting them in. Make sure all the wires are free and not pinching. Yeah, that looks good. Because this is the one place where it's really easy to pinch a wire. And then you don't know what happened, because when you get it on there, nothing works, and it's tough to find out. But this is usually when it happens, when you're just putting the shell back in place. Now this is the really critical one. You've got to make sure that you have covered every little sharp corner everywhere with a piece of tape. If you have a piece of sharp metal sticking out here, file down any burrs, because if any part of this frame touches that body, the antenna won't work. And if the antenna won't work, it won't get a signal, and nothing's going to work. So make sure you've got all that tape on there, and no part of this metal chassis will touch the shell. In addition, the kit has 4 of these nylon screws. Make sure you use the nylon screws to attach the chassis back into the body. We can't have any metal-to-metal contact between the chassis and the body. Now it's time to remove that temporary antenna. So we'll reach in, gently pull the Molex connector out, and we'll bring the shell over. Let's put him up here where you can see it better. And we're going to put this antenna in place. There we go. So here comes the packaging problem. Let's get everything in with nothing touching, nothing pinched. That looks good. Looks like the chassis is seated nicely into the body. Let's check to make very sure that we haven't pinched any wires and that this moves freely. Well, that's good. That's exactly what we want to have. It's got to have a little bit of play as the engine goes around curves and things. Now we're ready to put in the 4 nylon screws. If you don't own one of these tools, do yourself a favor. Go down to a nice hardware store and get a slot grabbing screwdriver. It goes in a slot like this, then you slide this down and it locks in place and it holds the screw on the end. This is an invaluable tool to have when you're trying to put these plastic screws into the body. You have to be able to hold them nicely like this. That will let you get right down here and very gently put these in. Now I said very gently because it's very, very easy to twist these off because it doesn't take much to twist a nylon screw. So don't put a lot of pressure on this screw or else you'll be miserably trying to pull a busted nylon stud out of the hole. And we'll do the last 3 here. And then we'll put it up there and we'll try her out for a test. In the instructions, they say that you may want to get a tap and tap the hole out and make sure that the threads thread nicely. They give you a metal screw that you can use as a tap to go up into the cast hole of the body to make sure that these plastic screws fit nicely. Here we go. We've got all 4 of them in. Let's take a final look. Let's examine everywhere, make sure we haven't pinched a wire anywhere, make sure there's no metal touching anywhere. I've wrapped tape everywhere around the sides. It looks like it hasn't torn, but our acid test will be when we put it up to the tender, put the tender onto the engine, plug it in, and if we have sound, that means it worked. If we don't have sound, that means we've torn the tape and we have to go back and do this again. All right, let's bring the power up on this guy. We'll get them up about 17 or 18 volts. And we haven't changed the engine address, so we can still say engine 1 and boost. Wow, that's nice. Now we've programmed this locomotive for 4 chuffs per revolution, so as he's rolling, you'll hear 4 chuffs. But because he's an old mechanical smoke unit, you won't get that synchronized smoke. If you wanted to go the extra cost of a fan-driven smoke unit, you could match the chuffs coming out of the stack with the sound and the wheel revolutions. Well, that'll do it for this session of the Back Shop. We'll see you next time.